The Atlantic Ocean. Vast. Relentless. During the Second World War, it became more than a body of water. It became a battlefield stretching from the icy Arctic to the equator. And beneath its dark surface, an invisible enemy waited. They were called U-boats, Unterseeboote, the pride of Hitler's Kriegsmarine, sleek, deadly submarines that could strike without warning and vanish without a trace. To Allied sailors, they were the nightmare below the waves, an enemy they could not see, could barely detect, and could never fully escape. From the first days of the war, these submarines hunted the convoys that carried life to Britain: food, oil, ammunition, and soldiers. In 1940 alone, the U-boats sent more than 1,000 Allied ships to the bottom of the sea. They struck in the night, rising to the surface like sharks. They fired their torpedoes, then slipped back into the depths before anyone could fight back. Every crossing of the Atlantic became a gamble. Would the convoy reach its destination or disappear into smoke and wreckage halfway across? The statistics were terrifying. In some months, Britain was losing more ships than it could build. The island's survival depended on those convoys. Without them, factories would stop, the army would run out of weapons, and the people would begin to starve. And yet, despite their best efforts, the Allies could not find a reliable way to fight the U-boats. They had sonar, or as it was called then, Acoustic, a technology that sent out sound waves to detect submarines. But the sea was full of tricks. Water temperature layers bent the sonar beams, turning real echoes into ghosts, and ghosts into real echoes. Sometimes, sonar operators heard what they thought was a submarine, only to find nothing. Other times, silence hid death. The Germans, for their part, were not standing still. They learned to evade detection, diving deep into thermal layers, turning off their engines, and waiting patiently while Allied ships wasted depth charges on empty water. They developed wolf-pack tactics, coordinated attacks that overwhelmed convoys from multiple directions at once. In the middle of the Atlantic, far from air cover and support, the ocean itself seemed to belong to them. For the men aboard Allied ships, the tension was unbearable. Days of calm could be shattered by a single explosion. At night, the horizon glowed with burning oil as another ship went down. Every sailor knew that once a torpedo struck, they had minutes, sometimes seconds, before the freezing water closed in. And behind this horror was a race between destruction and invention, between the hunters and those trying to outsmart them. In laboratories and workshops across Britain, Canada, and the United States, scientists and engineers worked around the clock. They experimented with new sonar systems, magnetic detectors, radar, and even strange decoys that might confuse enemy torpedoes. Most ideas failed. Some were too costly, others too impractical. But amid the endless noise of trial and error, one mind, one engineer, began to see the problem differently. He wasn't a famous inventor. He wasn't even part of the Navy. He was a civilian engineer with an obsession for patterns, sound, and the strange ways waves behaved underwater. Where others saw chaos, he saw opportunity, the possibility of turning the ocean itself into a weapon of deception. His colleagues thought he was mad. What he proposed went against every principle of traditional warfare. No guns, no bombs, no armor, just sound. An invisible weapon that could trick a submarine's own senses, create phantom ships on sonar screens, and make the hunters chase ghosts. At first it sounded impossible, but desperation can make people listen, especially in war. And so in a quiet corner of Britain's wartime research network, this engineer began building what many called his insane invention. No one knew it yet, but this strange device would change the game beneath the sea. It would make German captains doubt their instruments, doubt their instincts, even doubt their own sanity, and it would save countless lives in the process. He was not a soldier, not a naval commander, and not a man of medals or rank. He was an engineer who believed that logic and imagination could coexist, even in war. His name was Robert Newell, a quiet, meticulous mind who had spent years designing underwater sound equipment before the war began. When Britain called for help against the U-boats, he answered not with a rifle, but with a notebook and a pencil. Newell worked at a small research facility near Portsmouth, surrounded by endless sheets of equations, wires and metal casings that clattered under the weight of unfinished ideas. He studied the sea as if it were a living thing, unpredictable yet full of patterns waiting to be uncovered. Every sound that traveled through it told a story, The throb of propellers, the hum of machinery, the delicate echoes bouncing off the ocean floor. He listened to them all, searching for a way to turn sound itself into a weapon. He had seen the results of the submarine war firsthand. He had watched films of convoys exploding in fire and oil. He had heard the desperate reports from ship captains describing invisible attackers that struck and vanished. He knew that Britain was losing the war beneath the waves. Sonar could detect submarines, but never fast enough, never accurately enough. The U-boats always seemed one step ahead. One night, after another long day of failed tests, Newell wrote a single line in his notebook: "If they hunt by sound, let sound deceive them." It was a simple idea, but behind it lay a radical thought. What if, instead of chasing submarines, he could make submarines chase something that wasn't there? The concept was absurd. How could one fool a machine built to listen with such precision? Yet Newell knew that sonar, like any tool, could be tricked. Sound traveled differently through layers of water, bending and scattering depending on temperature and depth. To a submarine's sensors, the ocean could easily lie. If he could control those lies, if he could build a device that mimicked the sound of a ship, it might appear to the enemy as a real target. He began sketching designs, crude at first, then increasingly complex. Cylinders filled with motors and transmitters, small enough to be dropped into the sea, strong enough to survive pressure, clever enough to imitate the heartbeat of a vessel's propellers. It would not destroy the U-boats. It would distract them, lure them away, buy time for the convoys to escape. For weeks he worked in near silence, interrupted only by the sound of the wind outside and the faint ticking of instruments. His colleagues doubted him. They said it couldn't be done, that the Germans would never fall for such a trick. Some even laughed, calling it a phantom ship or Newell's folly. But he kept going. He tested small prototypes in tanks of salt water, recording the sound waves, adjusting the frequencies, changing the rhythm until it matched that of a real ship. Each improvement brought him closer. The day came when the device, no larger than a suitcase, produced the low throbbing pulse of a destroyer's engines so perfectly that even trained sonar operators mistook it for the real thing. Newell watched their confusion with quiet satisfaction. It worked. The ocean could be made to lie. He named the project Foxer, a decoy that would later evolve into what the Royal Navy called the noisemaker. Its purpose was simple: to deceive, to make the hunter waste its torpedoes on ghosts, to make the enemy doubt every sound it heard. Word of his invention spread through the research offices and into the Admiralty. Officers came to see demonstrations. They listened to the eerie rhythmic hum echoing through the speakers and realized that what sounded like madness might actually be a miracle. The approval came swiftly. Production was ordered. Within months, Newell's invention would be fitted onto warships crossing the Atlantic. Soon, his insane idea would be tested not in calm waters, but in the chaos of battle. And in that chaos, the ocean itself would become his ally. The first convoy to carry Newell's invention departed from Liverpool under a gray, restless sky. The men aboard had been briefed, but most of them didn't understand what the device really did. They only knew its nickname, the Foxer. It was mounted at the rear of several escort ships, a set of strange metal tubes that trailed behind the vessels like something alive. When activated, it filled the sea with noise, a dense, rhythmic clatter that merged with the ocean's heartbeat. To the sailors listening on deck, it sounded like chaos, metallic echoes, deep throbs, and distant pulses, all overlapping. But to a German submarine listening through its hydrophones, it was something else entirely. It was the sound of a target. For days, the convoy moved across the Atlantic under constant threat. Somewhere beneath them, U-boats waited, tracking every vibration. The submarine captains trusted their instruments completely. Sonar was their only vision in the dark. When the first Foxers were switched on, those instruments began to lie. The U-boat crews heard what they believed to be large warships moving at full speed. Their dials spiked, their headphones filled with propeller beats, so convincing that even seasoned captains thought they had found a perfect target. They maneuvered into firing position, aligning their torpedoes with phantom ships that existed only as sound. Torpedoes were launched. They streaked through the black water, leaving trails of bubbles, then vanished into nothingness. The real convoy, a few hundred meters ahead, never even knew they had been targeted. The U-boats, confused by the echoes bouncing between layers of water, assumed they had missed. They circled, listening again, chasing the same illusion. wasting hours of precious fuel and revealing their own positions to the escort ships above. Reports began to reach the Admiralty. Convoys that had once suffered heavy losses were now crossing with minimal damage. Captains spoke of torpedoes that exploded harmlessly in the distance, of submarines surfacing too soon, believing they had already sunk their prey. The ocean, once an enemy, was suddenly playing tricks on the hunters. Newell received the first confirmation in a short coded message: "Decoy effective. U-boats confused. Continue production." It was brief, clinical, but to him it meant everything. His insane idea had survived its first encounter with the enemy. Weeks later, the Germans realized something was wrong. Their sonar operators began to report strange readings, ships that seemed to multiply, targets that appeared and vanished within seconds. Some captains accused their crews of incompetence. Others suspected the British had developed a new type of ship that could hide itself. Nobody could explain the mystery of the ghost convoys. Inside the U-boat fleet, uncertainty grew. Rumors spread that the Atlantic had become cursed, that Allied ships carried a kind of invisible shield. What the Germans didn't know was that the sound they were hearing wasn't a shield at all. It was a lie, a man-made illusion of metal and echo, born in the mind of a quiet engineer who understood how fear and confusion could be as deadly as gunfire. The success of the Foxer led to rapid improvements. Engineers refined the frequencies, adjusted the volume, and designed systems that could imitate multiple ships at once. Soon, entire convoys could sound twice their actual size. Submarine captains found themselves surrounded by false targets, unable to tell what was real. Every torpedo fired in the wrong direction was a victory bought without blood. For the sailors on the surface, the device became a silent guardian. They no longer felt completely blind when they crossed the Atlantic. Some nights, when the Foxers hummed in the black water, they swore they could hear the enemy moving away. And far from the battle, in his small office filled with blueprints and recordings, Robert Newell listened to the sound of the device playing through his speakers. He heard the steady pulse that had once been just an idea in his notebook. It was strange to think that something so small, so simple, could turn the tide of an entire war. The world would never know his name, but his invention was out there, drifting in the waves, saving lives in silence. The convoy, code-named HX-237, sailed from Halifax in the spring of 1943, carrying food, fuel, and supplies that Britain desperately needed. The men aboard knew the crossing would be dangerous. The Atlantic had claimed hundreds of ships that year alone, but this time they had something new. Each escort ship towed behind it the strange, rattling devices that Newell's team had built in secret workshops. They called them noisemakers, but the name did not capture their power. The first days passed in uneasy calm. The ocean stretched endlessly in every direction, gray and cold beneath an unbroken sky. The men stood watch through salt-stung eyes, scanning the horizon, listening for the faintest sound of a torpedo's wake. Below them, the new machines clattered and groaned, filling the water with their artificial rhythm, a steady metallic heartbeat that mixed with the song of the sea. Then, late one night, the lookouts spotted the faint glimmer of a periscope. The alarm rang out, destroyers broke formation and raced to intercept. Sonar operators strained at their headphones, but the readings were confused, scattered, uncertain. The U-boat had already vanished into the depths. Minutes later, a torpedo struck one of the trailing ships, or so they thought. The explosion echoed through the darkness, but when the smoke cleared, there was no fire, no sinking hull. The torpedo had detonated hundreds of meters behind the convoy, chasing the false sound of a Foxer. The escort commanders realized what had happened. The decoys were working. Another torpedo came, then another. Each one missed. The U-boats, locked onto the deafening noise of the machines, were attacking ghosts. On sonar screens, the sea became a maze of echoes. Submarine captains could no longer tell what was real and what was illusion. Some turned away entirely, certain they had been tricked. Others stayed to fight, wasting precious torpedoes on phantom targets until the British destroyers closed in with depth charges. That night, the convoy made it through unscathed, not a single ship lost. The radio reports from the Atlantic stunned the Admiralty. For the first time in years, the hunters had become the hunted. Back in Portsmouth, Robert Newell received the news in the early hours of morning. He sat alone in his workshop, the hum of his equipment still filling the air. When the message came, HX-237 arrived safely, 0 losses. He closed his eyes and smiled for the first time in months. It was not triumph he felt, but relief. He had spent years fighting numbers, equations, skepticism. Now his creation had saved real lives, men he would never meet, sailors who would never know his name. The Admiralty demanded mass production. Dozens of factories began building the devices, refining their design, making them lighter, stronger, and easier to deploy. Soon, every escort ship leaving Britain carried a set of Foxers, trailing in its wake. The Atlantic, once ruled by the U-boats, began to change. German records later revealed the growing panic among submarine crews. They called the Decoy Die Leierkasten, the hurdy-gurdy, because of its mechanical song. To them, it was maddening. Some captains believed the British had developed invisible ships, others thought their sonar had been sabotaged. The deception struck deeper than any weapon. It planted doubt, and in the cold, pressure-filled silence of the deep, doubt was fatal. Throughout the summer of 1943, U-boat losses mounted. Every failed attack, every wasted torpedo, pushed them closer to defeat. The Atlantic, once their hunting ground, became their grave. Allied convoys grew stronger, safer, more confident. Supplies flowed freely again. The balance of the war began to tilt. Newell never sought recognition. He stayed in his laboratory, improving the devices, recording the sounds of real ships, fine-tuning frequencies to make the illusion more convincing. When asked what he had built, he gave a simple answer: a lie that tells the truth. A lie that told the enemy they were winning when in fact they were drowning. The Foxer became one of many innovations that together broke the back of the U-boat threat. Radar, code breaking, air patrols, all played their part. But among them all, Newell's device stood apart, not because it destroyed the enemy, but because it fooled them. It used the sea itself as a stage for illusion, turning sound into survival. By the end of the war, the statistics told the story. U-boat kills had dropped sharply. Allied shipping losses had fallen by half. And though few outside the Navy ever heard the name Robert Newell, his invention quietly shaped the outcome of the Battle of the Atlantic. In the years that followed, Newell left the Navy's service and returned to his quiet life. He never spoke publicly about what he had done. The Foxers were dismantled, their secrets filed away in forgotten archives. But those who knew remembered the sound, the clatter that had echoed through the depths, the song that had fooled the hunters and saved the hunted. The ocean keeps its secrets, but somewhere in that vast, restless water, the ghosts of those machines still drift, silent reminders of a time when sound itself became a weapon. When the guns finally fell silent in 1945, the seas were littered with the wreckage of a world at war. Dozens of U-boats lay broken on the ocean floor, entombed in darkness, while Allied convoys steamed safely across waters that had once been graveyards. The Battle of the Atlantic, the longest and most brutal campaign of the war, had been won. Yet few knew that victory had been shaped not only by courage or firepower, but by the quiet ingenuity of an engineer who had chosen deception over destruction. Robert Newell never stood in parades or accepted medals. His work remained classified long after the war ended, hidden in technical reports and naval archives. But among the officers who had commanded the convoys, his name carried weight. They knew that the Foxer, that strange, clattering machine that sang beneath the waves, had given them the edge when nothing else could. Historians would later call it one of the simplest yet most effective countermeasures of the war. It didn't fire a weapon, didn't sink a ship, didn't kill a single man, and yet by confusing the enemy's senses, it saved thousands. It proved that intelligence could be as powerful as any torpedo, that a clever mind could alter the course of a conflict fought by nations. As the years passed, new wars came and went, and technology evolved. Submarines grew faster, quieter, more advanced. Sonar became digital. The cat-and-mouse game between hunter and hunted continued beneath the world's oceans. But the principles Newell had uncovered, the manipulation of sound, the art of acoustic illusion, remained. Modern navies still use echoes, false signals, and decoys to mislead their enemies. The idea born in that small workshop near Portsmouth became the foundation of an entire field, acoustic countermeasures. In 1960, decades after the end of the war, a group of naval engineers visited Newell's home. They brought with them recordings of modern decoy tests, sleek, computerized descendants of his original device. As they played the tapes, the sound filled the room. the same rhythmic hum that once echoed through the Atlantic night. Newell listened quietly, smiling faintly. "It still sounds like hope," he said. But his legacy went beyond engineering. His invention had revealed something fundamental about war, that deception could protect rather than destroy, that the power of illusion could be used not for cruelty, but for mercy. The Foxer had not killed, it had confused, and in that confusion, men had survived. For the sailors who crossed the Atlantic, its sound became the sound of safety. Many remembered standing on the deck in the middle of the night, hearing that strange metallic rhythm coming from the dark waters behind the ship. It was eerie, almost alive, the heartbeat of an unseen guardian. Some believed that as long as they could hear it, they would make it home. In the decades that followed, memorials were built for those who fought and died in the Battle of the Atlantic. Names were carved into stone, thousands of them. But somewhere, in the quiet lines of those memorials, the spirit of Newell's work lingered. For every name that was lost, there were others who lived because of what he had made. The ocean has long memories. The waves that once carried convoys now carry cargo ships and research vessels, their engines humming where once the Foxers sang. The sea forgets nothing. Not the fear, not the courage, not the strange inventions that changed the course of history. Robert Newell died in obscurity, his story buried beneath layers of official secrecy. But his idea, that sound could be shaped into a shield, outlived him. Today, every modern navy owes something to that idea, to that quiet moment of inspiration when a man, surrounded by equations and doubt, wrote 7 words that changed everything. If they hunt by sound, let sound deceive them. The war had demanded genius. He gave it madness, the kind of madness that saves lives, and in doing so, he proved that even in the darkest of times, human imagination can find a way to fight back, not with violence, but with brilliance. The war ended, but the sound remained. In the years that followed, the Atlantic returned to peace. The convoys were gone, the sea lanes open once more. The men who had survived went home, built lives, raised families. Yet when they gathered in old age to tell their stories, they always spoke of one thing, the noise that saved them. The deep metallic rhythm that followed their ships through the black water, the hum that meant they were not alone. For them, it was more than a machine. It was a voice, steady and unbroken, whispering through the chaos that hope still lived somewhere in the dark. Some sailors called it the ocean's heartbeat. Others said it was the sound of survival. To all of them, it was a memory they would never forget. Robert Newell's name never appeared in headlines. He received no medals, no public honors. His work remained classified until long after his death, sealed away in dusty files marked technical countermeasures. But for those who studied the war, for those who traced the long tangled story of the Battle of the Atlantic, his fingerprints were unmistakable. In the margins of reports and research notes, there were references to the Newell principle, a quiet acknowledgement of the man who had turned sound into salvation. When his story finally came to light, historians struggled to place him in the grand narrative of the war. He wasn't a general or a commander. He hadn't fought on the front lines. He had sat in silence, listening to the world beneath the waves. But perhaps that was what made him extraordinary. He had fought the war in a place where there were no medals to win, no crowds to cheer, only equations, patience, and faith in an idea that sounded impossible. His invention was never meant to destroy. It existed only to deceive, to buy moments of safety, to confuse the machines of war long enough for human beings to live. It stood as proof that ingenuity could be a weapon as powerful as courage. In later years, when new generations of engineers studied the history of sonar and acoustic warfare, they found themselves drawn to his work. They discovered not only the science, but the philosophy within it, that deception, when used to protect, is not dishonor, but wisdom. That the mind, when pushed to its limits, can create miracles out of noise and chaos. Today, the idea lives on in countless forms. Modern ships carry advanced decoys that can mimic entire fleets. Submarines deploy sound projectors that trick enemy sensors. Satellites, drones, and algorithms all use echoes, signals, and illusions, direct descendants of Newell's first experiment. Technology has changed, but the principle remains the same. If they hunt by sound, let sound deceive them. And yet, even as the world moves deeper into the digital age, there is something hauntingly human about his story. A man alone in a small room, surrounded by notes and wires, listening to the ocean and daring to imagine that it could be fooled. It is a story of curiosity, of defiance, of quiet genius in the face of unimaginable fear. When the sea is calm and the wind is low, some sailors swear they can still hear it, faint, distant, beneath the waves. The steady pulse of a machine long gone, the echo of an impossible idea that once turned the tide of war. It is not the sound of battle, it is not the sound of victory, it is the sound of human invention refusing to surrender.